Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Bowman, Editor-in-Chief of Supply Chain Brain, and I want to welcome you to this special presentation on secrets and strategies for successful supply chain risk management. First in a three-part series in 2023 on the dawn of the new supply chain presented by Gartner. Now, a quick reminder before we get started. Don't miss the Gartner Supply Chain Symposium and Expo, the world's most important gathering of chief supply chain officers and executives. Join us from May 8th through 10th in Orlando, Florida, and from June 5th through 7th in Barcelona, Spain. Learn more at gartner.com/conf/SC and register with the code GARTSCB for an exclusive discount. One additional reminder, there will be an audience question and answer session at the end of this presentation. Audience members are encouraged to submit your questions at any time during the presentation by clicking on that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Now, disruption has become a constant in global supply chains, and because of it, supply chain risk management has never been more important. Chief supply chain officers and supply chain leaders need to approach risk management quite differently than they have in the past. In today's session, we'll share the secrets and strategies to successful supply chain risk management. Let me introduce our speakers for today. Joanne Joliet is Vice President Analyst at Gartner, Inc. Joanne provides insight and advisory support to chief supply chain officers and heads of supply chain strategy on digital strategy, transformation, and execution, helping companies to achieve agility and resilience in their supply chains. Previously, Joanne held leadership positions with Gartner, AWS, Belk Department Stores, Family Dollar Stores, and Accenture, where she led digital transformation efforts. Heather Wheatley is Senior Director Analyst at Gartner. Heather is specialist and thought leader in risk management, demonstrating how it can boost stakeholder value, enhance agility, and deliver organization goals. She's spent over 25 years working in risk-related roles with a diverse range of organizations, including the UK Ministry of Defence, Johnson Matthey, and Tesco. So with that, I want to pass it off to Joanne Joliet. Joanne, take it away.
Great. Thanks for having us, Bob. I really appreciate it. I'd like to talk to you today about supply chain obstacles and opportunities. Crisis creates opportunity, and over the last 3 years, we have seen disruption expose the brittleness and weakness of our supply chains. Many organizations did not have good or robust risk management practices. Risk management was limited to just a couple categories, if that at all. There certainly was no prioritization of the risks that were raining down on supply chains. And this put CSCOs and supply chain leaders in a constant state of reactivity. Now is the time to correct this. This is the dawn of a new supply chain, and with this comes the opportunity from all the disruption and chaos. Let's take a look. Certainly, as Bob mentioned, risk has become a constant for supply chains. Here are just 6 macro risks that continue to pressure test our supply chains and create disruption. Certainly global supply chain disruptions that we see in the news every day, economic headwinds with the World Bank forecasting a significant drop in growth, geopolitical conflict that we're seeing every day overseas and even here in the US. Talent remains a constant pressure, energy is a rising pressure, and certainly cybersecurity as well. But in all of these, there is opportunity to improve our supply chain. So let's take a look at each of them and find the opportunities as well. This should be no surprise that 75% of supply chain leaders have reported an increase in high impact disruptions compared to 5 years ago. This is most of us. We felt this both personally and professionally. But there is a sliver of individuals who haven't reported that increase. And those individuals were prepared for risk, had planned for it, and preempted it effectively. And that's what Heather will talk to you about in a little bit as far as prioritizing, quantifying, and exercising risk management practices. There certainly is an opportunity for greater innovation and creativity from these risks. And we certainly had seen that over the last 3 years with new business models, new products, new collaboration, and other opportunities. I get the question a lot about how do we do this when we are under such economic and cost pressures? The answer to that is you can't afford not to do it. So even though we are expecting a sharp decline in GDP growth, if you look at the total trajectory of years to come, it's positive. And we know from our research that leaders who make the no regret investments in periods of economic challenges come out of those economic moments much better than their counterparts. Those digital leaders who invest have 3 times more likely ability to achieve above industry revenue and margin growth from that economic moment. So even though cost is a pressure, certainly you need to press forward. Geopolitical conflict, whether we're talking about balloons or drones or just anything that's happening around our world, this is again becoming a constant in our news every day. From our research, you can see 95% of organizations are evaluating and executing changes to their China strategy. That's just one example. But this is not about China. This is about understanding where your risks are in your supply chain, modifying your network strategy so that you have redundancy and resiliency before that disruption happens. Again, early identification and option and instilling those options will certainly position your supply chains to be much stronger in the future, let alone in the current moment. The challenge with talent will continue, certainly in supply chains and enterprises as a whole. From our research, we see that 83% of supply chain employees have reported feeling overwhelmed. I'm sure many of us on this call probably feel that in the fatigue that we've felt from the last 3 years and certainly both personally and professionally. From our human deal framework and research, oopsies, sorry. Okay, so I'm trying to, there we go, hold on. Trying to get these windows out of the way, my apologies. From our human deal framework, we know that by creating a more human-centric supply chain, you can have a better opportunity to improve performance of your supply chain individuals, improve retention, and overall satisfaction of your employees. And what does that really mean? This is beyond just compensation, but really creating roles that allow them to share their values and visions with their employees, feel understood by their employees, have purposeful work, and have flexibility even at the front line. So given the talent crisis and challenges with talent, the opportunity here is to instill these in your talent strategy for supply chain so that you are far better off than your competitors. Energy is another severe risk that's facing supply chains, both in the short term as well as in the long term. From our research, 44% of business leaders expect increased energy costs, at least for the next 24 months or beyond. But this isn't just about cost, this is about energy security and understanding where your risk is relative to that based on your operational strategy. The opportunity with energy is not just to manage and hedge costs today, but look at your energy needs and identify emerging technologies that can support you both in a corporate environment, all your manufacturing, and across your supply chain end to end. So you are literally not left in the cold and dark. The last risk I'd like to share with you is an increased risk for cybersecurity events. Now, certainly, we've heard a lot of this in the news. Generally, IT is leading this. But as you can see from the chart, 31% of our respondents had stated that they had been involved in a cybersecurity attack in the last 24 months. 16% said they didn't know. Given that it takes on average 277 days to identify and contain an attack, I would argue that some of those 16% are actually in the yes category. So again, this is your opportunity to partner with your IT counterparts to increase cybersecurity for your supply chain. 83% of respondents from our survey had stated that they plan to increase cybersecurity budgets. So now is the time and the opportunity to ensure that those budgets adequately cover supply chain. But wait, there's more. In addition to those macro risks, there are additional supply chain risks that are coming from within. This is delivery of strategy and what's associated as far as how that's supported with your org design, your culture, other disruptions, whether that could be transformation or mergers and acquisition activity, functional areas, your suppliers, your procurement, your planning, all the logistics, making sure that your partners there are certainly you're managing and monitoring the risk associated with those areas. And then lastly, new products, new technology, legal frameworks, and sales. So not only do you need to manage risk externally to your enterprise, but also manage it internally as well. What this creates is a polycrisis. This term was introduced in the 70s and then resurged recently from the World Economic Forum, but really, as you can see on the slide, it is a cluster of related global risks with compounding effects where the total exceeds the sum of each part. And that's what we have with all of our macro risks and our internal risk as well. So your risk management practice needs to account for each of these. What got you here won't get you there. And you've all heard that quote before. And so making sure that you have that solid practice end to end that goes through 4 key steps, which I'll talk about in a minute, is imperative. The good news is that from our research, our respondents have said nearly 80% have committed to being more proactive and better prepared for disruption with respect to their operations. So there's good intent there. Unfortunately, we're seeing poor results. Only 38% of organizations implement lessons learned from past crises, and so they're not repeating mistakes. We see that only 57% of organizations have a formal risk appetite, and Heather will talk to you about that in just a minute. And then only 33% of organizations are mapping interdependencies between risks. So this is truly a problem between what needs to happen versus what is happening. So if we look at effective risk management, there are 4 key activities that will move you from a low effectiveness to a high effectiveness from a risk response perspective. First is horizon scanning. So all of those things that I just spoke about, those macro risks, those global risks, as well as what's happening within your organization. The second is you must understand the impact of those risks. And Heather will talk about how you quantify those in just a minute. You need activities and actions for mitigation of those risks. And you must simulate those crisis situations. Unfortunately, what happens is most people stop here at the horizon scanning point versus going through the additional steps to achieve a robust risk management practice. Unfortunately, if you stop here, you will be in that constant state of reactivity that I mentioned, where many supply chain leaders and CSCOs continue to find themselves in today. So with that, we're going to break for commercial, and Heather will come back in a minute and walk you through some of the activities in order to instill effective risk management within your practice.
GEP helps global enterprises become more agile, competitive, and profitable. Its unified approach to delivering supply chain solutions integrates strategy, software, and managed services. GEP builds supply chain resilience and sustainability by decreasing risk, reducing operating costs, improving inventory and warehouse management, and increasing margins. More than 500 Fortune 500 and Global 2000 enterprises count on GEP to solve business challenges and achieve goals through fresh thinking, innovative products, unrivaled expertise, and passionate people. Visit GEP.com to learn more. WorkStep is the leading listening and engagement platform for the front line. It's the only solution designed for HR, operations, and the hourly associate to reduce turnover and increase worker productivity. With WorkStep, companies get the real-time feedback they need to take action and retain their frontline workforce for the long run. For more information, go to workstep.com. So with that, I want to bring up Heather Wheatley for her portion of the presentation. Heather, take it away.
Thanks, Bob. So what I'm going to take you through now is some of the thought processes and activities that leading supply chains are doing to move that dial on risk management. I can't say this enough though. All risks must link to your strategic objectives and goals. And this should absolutely be your starting point for anything concerned with risk. And why do I say this? Well, it's super easy to ask folks what the risks are. And you'll probably get a list as long as your arm. And some of these will be issues, so things that are happening now, and some of them will be pretty low level things, and others will be really important. And they're the ones you want to focus on. By explicitly linking risk to objectives, you can think through what the true impact might be if it materializes, get absolutely grounded in terms of what we as organizations are prioritizing, look at the risks that might impact our ability to achieve those objectives, and help with determining the trade-offs between risk, mitigation, and reward. So with this laser focus on our objectives, what we're also seeing is a move from siloed risk management, where risks were traditionally considered in functional areas, to this end-to-end approach. So historically, for example, new product development teams think through the effectiveness of the product and the risks associated with that. Sourcing might be looking at the availability of suppliers, planning with the risks associated with the ability to deliver, and manufacturing might be looking at business continuity. Logistics, for example, might be thinking right now about the availability of labor to drive those trucks. Of course, risks are also impacted and created externally to our organization, but risks that are created internally in one area often have a direct impact on another. For example, is your new product design process inadvertently developing a product with a single source supplier and increasing risk? So what we're increasingly seeing is this end-to-end risk management process being put in place that covers all of the risks that Joanne talked about and considers these right across the supply chain. And by doing this, we can base our risk decisions in an end-to-end way, focusing those mitigations on agreed appetite, value, and mission-critical activities, therefore helping to deliver that strategy. And you'll see at the bottom of the slide that this is all facilitated by supply chain risk experts. And these folks are the glue that brings everything together, working with all of these functions to identify, help them assess, and also mitigate risk. So this glue then, the backbone of risk management, if you like, within supply chains. I'd like to pick out just a few of those activities that we see them undertaking. So these folks help to provide that link between the CSCO, the supply chain organization, and also upwards to corporate and enterprise risk teams. What they do is they provide an excellent route to report coherently and consistently upwards. It also helps organizational senior leaders understand where exposures are and seek those help for mitigations. So picking out just a few of activities that we do then. Firstly, then, no-brainer. We generally see them setting the process and governance for risk management. Again, clearly providing that link to any corporate level systems that are in place. And this includes determining how we're going to identify risk, how we're going to assess risk, possibly a playbook for mitigations, and how we're going to determine risk ownership. They're also facilitating risk information and risk technology that we can leverage to make this quicker and smoother. So thinking about what we have in our ERP systems, our warehouse management systems, and also then thinking about supply chain risk management software and solutions and pulling that all together. This team also help the supply chain and the wider business determine value and risk associated with our activities, and also our suppliers and dependencies within the supply chains. And I'd also like to finally on this slide draw your attention to the materialized risk section. This is super interesting, and as Joanne said, many organizations don't learn the lessons from previous crises. Having an independent risk team that can help you do this without blame is really important. On the flip side to this, though, they should also be thinking of the risks that we've avoided or the ones that we've managed super well and use this learning to share within the organization. So let's move to the risk process now and see how organizations generally lay out this for supply chains. Well, anchoring their risk and resilience thought processes around this concept of importance. So defining what is important to you as an organization and what you want to protect. This is where the linked strategy comes in thick and fast. What they're then doing is they're thinking about the key risk areas, for example, geopolitical, cyber, operational, financial, and they are mapping these to the portfolio and across activities. Once they've done this, they are identifying risk mitigations, and these are kind of in two camps. So those proactive mitigations that we take before a risk materializes, and also reactive after an event takes place. So do you hold inventory up front in preparation, but you should also have really great business continuity plans. And what I'm starting to see on this is we're becoming a little bit more hardball about those mitigations. And we are making sure that if we are thinking about them and we can use them, that they must be in place and they must be effective. We're also within supply chain very clearly thinking about the concept of risk appetite. So this is a determination of how much risk you want to take, not how much risk you can take, but how much you want to take. And this is all about how much mitigations we want to put in place. And what we'll do is we'll come back to risk appetite in a moment. Where appropriate then, supply chains are implementing further risk mitigations and they are checking they're in place. We're also at this point testing our plans and playbooks to make sure that they absolutely work. And finally, and importantly, what we're doing is monitoring risks. And it's fair to say that in the last 3 years, we know that risks have the ability to hit us quickly. What this part of the process does is it keeps a continuous watch on what risks are escalating, what's evolving, and also what is changing. Many organizations are purchasing supply chain management, risk management solutions to help them with this. And what is needed, though, if you have such solutions, is good governance around alerts. The last thing some poor person wants is 300 alerts in their inbox all at once. This governance defines the trigger points for when a risk is within tolerance and what happens when it's not. Also, importantly, is scenario planning. So thinking about the what if. So what if the gas price goes up? Or what if we go into an inflation? Or what if there's more geopolitical crises in the world? And thinking through those scenarios, assessing the impact of those, and allowing us to make good risk-based decisions. By doing this process, what we are focusing on and what we are focusing our risk management on is those things that matter the most. And this is a super effective solution when we don't have endless resources to mitigate every single risk that we might encounter everywhere in our organization. So on to the thorny subject of risk appetite then. Well, I wonder whether this slide surprises you or it doesn't. This shows that 57% of boards are telling us that they're actually increasing their risk appetite. So what they're basically saying is that they are prepared to take more risk. Is that message filtering down to you? Now, you could look at this in another way and think maybe they're taking a step back and they are level setting expectations due to the sheer amount of risk that exists right now and our ability to respond and still be profitable. What I would say to you, though, is that risk appetite is super important and it sets that philosophy for risk and should filter down from the board through your exco and onto supply chain operations. And without this thought process, it's really hard to determine what risks we should mitigate more. And why do I say all this? It's because your stakeholders will have different views on risk appetite, and that will depend on a number of different factors, their background, their knowledge of the subject, and indeed their general willingness to take risk in life. It's important that you have risk appetite grounded within your organization. And I'd urge you to think through with your stakeholders what risks you're willing to take and what are non-negotiable for you. So where do you start with what the risks might be? And it's fair to say that none of us have got a crystal ball, but within Gartner, we produce lots of tools and information to help with risk identification and scenario planning. And what you see in the screen in front of you is one of the tools that relates to what the emerging risks in supply chain might be. Now, I do smile when I see this, because last year when we issued this document, we'd had identified roughly 70 different emerging risks. This time when we've redone it, well, it's well over 110. So what does that tell you about the risk environment? But what this tool allows you to do is it allows you to put the risks on the table. And when I think about the risk environment right now, and all the risks that have materialized in the last 3 years, nothing should be off that table. It allows you to collaborate both within supply chain and the wider organization to understand the implications of risk. And you should also use these risks as part of your scenario planning process and think through both the impact to your organization and your ability to respond. So let's think then about the implementation of further mitigation. So more resilience. And I see that there's a question actually in the Q&A that I can pick up now about dollarizing risk elements. So where do we start with all of this then? The first thing that you should do when we're thinking about risk is take a broad view of cost. And cost can be a major barrier to resilience. And if you are able to count both the number and the costs of disruptions, this conversation becomes easy. And I don't mean just the cost of lost revenue, but the wider costs associated with risk events. And this gives you a true baseline of what extra costs you've been incurring, and also gives you a measure of how good your response should be if a risk materializes. And just to kind of give you an outline of how folks are using this sort of calculator, what they're doing is looking backwards to say, in the last year, we've had these disruptions, it's cost us this amount. Do we want to do something different? And also projecting forwards to say, if this risk materializes, these are the sorts of costs that will occur. And actually, where do we want to put our mitigations? These costs, though, come from a number of different sources, and they include not just that revenue lost piece, but asset downtime costs, inventory relocation, expedited shipping, overtime, rework, staff relocation costs, and supplier continuity costs. This list is probably bigger than you imagine. This tool is really, as I said, a super powerful tool for scenario planning. And you can think through the process of, if scenario X happens, what would we do and what would be the costs? And in that way, you can position your discussions on further mitigations as well. And finally, though, we want our risk process to drive decisions. And I see lots of risk processes that are basically this kind of reporting vortex. Information goes up and nothing comes back down. Our risk processes should force people to make decisions. Do nothing, do more, or indeed do less. And what I'm increasingly seeing organizations do is looking at risk in terms of two different factors here. The impact of risk versus how well we are prepared. So how good are our mitigations? And what you'll see on the screen is 4 boxes. And what we want to do is focus our attention on those 2 at the top. So firstly, those risks in that improved box. And these risks have got a big impact, right? They're the ones that are going to be financially huge and also stop us meeting our strategy. But if they were to materialize today, we know our mitigations would not be effective enough. These are the ones that we should truly focus on in order to meet our strategic goals. and we need to focus on these for further mitigations. Now, given the crazy risk environment that we're in, it's financially prohibitive to mitigate everything down to the lowest possible level. And we must make a decision on some of these risks. And these are the risks that organizations will put into the monitor box. So risks that, yep, they might have a big impact, but risks where we may not have any options, or risks where we've decided we are not going to do anything further. What we need to do, though, is make this a business decision. So in terms of those costs, how much do we want to invest, and force that business to make that decision? So the last thought I'll leave you with is this. It's really easy to think of all of the risks we face in the world today and get, well, quite frankly, a little bit depressed. But what I'd say separates out those high-performing supply chains is they see risk and uncertainty not as a simple negative. They look at this crazy world that we're in as a massive opportunity to be ahead of the curve and drive that progress towards our strategy in a focused and cost-effective way. All the uncertainty we face today is in fact an opportunity for us. And I'd encourage you to use your risk processes to seek out those opportunities to help us deliver for our continued success.
Get ready for the Gartner Supply Chain Symposium and Expo, the world's most important gathering of chief supply chain officers and executives. At this year's conference, you'll learn how to develop agile and resilient supply chain strategies, pursue digital initiatives that drive business growth, mitigate risk, and respond to disruption. Join us from May 8th through 10th in Orlando, Florida, and from June 5th through 7th in Barcelona, Spain. Learn more at gartner.com/conf/SC and register with the code GARTSCB for an exclusive discount. So with that conversation, Heather, also discussion portion of our presentation. You for a great presentation. That was really enlightening and a lot of good information there, although I'm still a little bit depressed myself, Heather, so I'm going to need some reassurance.
Sorry.
That's all right. It's better to be realistic than to put on the blinders about the importance of this kind of stuff. But let me first ask this question, and I'll pose it to both of you. Maybe I'll start with you, Heather. How do we justify the investment in advancing our risk management capabilities, especially given the current cost-constrained environment?
So I appreciate it's hard. And it's hard because of that question of how can I justify investment in either risk management or risk mitigations to manage a risk that might or might not happen. So there's a lot of kind of fundamentally different moving pieces here. And this is honestly the conversation that many of our clients have. What I would say is counting that cost of previous disruptions is so super powerful. If you know you have spent X million dollars, and it will be $1 million on disruption in the last year, and this will be unbudgeted risk response money, it then helps you set that tone for moving things forward to say, risk world is crazy right now. Do we want to spend X million dollars next year, or do we want to do something different?
Nothing happened last year, so why should we bother with the next, right? Joanne, what do you think about justifying the investment at a time when it's very difficult to assess what you save by something that actually didn't happen?
Yeah, it is challenging with so many competing priorities, but you can't afford not to, right? And that's what I was saying with respect to the no regret investments. You have to identify and prioritize those that will serve you now, in whether you need them now in this moment or in the future. When you look at supply chain strategy and where your risks are relative to that, and as Heather said, making sure that you're linking those to your goals and objectives, you have to identify where you are okay to be resilient, meaning you can take the impact of a disruption and respond and recover, or where you absolutely need to be agile and avoid that disruption altogether. And so when you look at the investments in risk management, that will shorten your list pretty quickly and prioritize it pretty effectively.
You have both presented us with a long laundry list of things that need to be done in order to achieve proper resilience and a good risk management program. But I imagine a company might find itself a little intimidated by that list, as necessary as it might be. Question is, where do we start? How do we build a supply chain risk management function that is effective? What are those first initial steps, Heather?
So I'm not for one moment saying that organizations are not managing risk. Okay, we are managing risk. And actually, this is the fundamental place to start. So I'd be looking at, where do we already do risk management within supply chain? Where are we already thinking about it, and who is doing it? And indeed, who is setting risk appetite? So almost a gap analysis of kind of where you are and what you've got and what you need. I'd think through what's been successful and what has been less successful. And then what I'd start with is one of your top performing products and work through that cycle that I showed you. So think through, where does this product go from end to end supply chain? Then think through, where are the risks coming in? And then think about building your process up from there. And of course, we need risk management skills and capabilities. And those skills in many organizations are, not necessarily analytic skills, but the power to have a good discussion with people and drive those sometimes difficult discussions about manage more or manage not. The one thing I would say, though, is it's super important to recognize that your risk team should not be owning the risks. These belong to the business. And what the fundamental thing that the risk team should do is set themselves up as an enabler of business decisions, not necessarily a maker of business decisions.
Now, who needs another silo? We complain about that all the time. You certainly don't want that to happen. Joanne, baby steps. What do you suggest?
Yeah, absolutely. I echo Heather's comments that certainly the organizations that we're working with are doing risk management. But again, with 68% and a constant state of reactivity, there's opportunity to improve. From my perspective, in the conversations I'm having with CSCOs, I think the greatest opportunity is to ensure there's equal partnership of the supply chain with the rest of the enterprise. We know from our future supply chain report that top performing organizations view the supply chain and the CSCO as an equal partner. And that's the first step in achieving that collaboration with the business, so that the risk management and risk identification, quantification, and scenario planning is done holistically across the enterprise. And not just siloed within supply chain. And so I think, looking at what you're doing today and identifying those areas of opportunity to extend that across the entire enterprise, for me, is really kind of step one.
Both of you haven't pressed upon us the importance of linking risk to strategic objectives. Sounds good on paper, but how? And especially given the fact that you don't really ever know what kind of risk you're preparing for, and strategic objectives can change too. How do you do that link? Joanne, maybe you can give us some guidance on that.
Yeah, going back to Heather's slide of all risks need to be linked to your strategic goals and objectives. What we see most often is many companies aren't looking at the right risks and monitoring the wrong risks. And so that's first and foremost, is making sure that from whether our tool set or your own capabilities in assessing what risks there are, that you are prioritizing and linking to the strategy. And again, where can you afford to be resilient and where must you be agile in order to not only remain viable, but certainly competitive as well. I'd also look at your strategy and understand how the risk can be a springboard for innovation and new opportunity, and looking at that versus just looking at the downside of risk.
Interesting balance, I think you're calling for companies to strike, because on one hand, you were saying so many companies are not learning the lessons of the past. On the other hand, there's a possibility of spending too much time looking in the rearview mirror when you don't actually know what's coming up. Heather, do you have any guidance for us on how we can balance those two things, looking back and looking forward?
Yeah, so many organizations, in terms of looking backwards, what they're thinking about again is looking through those previous disruptions. But what I would say is that in the risk world, the past is not necessarily a terrific indicator of what might happen in the future. what we do within Gartner is we produce lots of documents and scenarios, for example, for looking forward. So scenarios associated with what the geopolitical world might look like, and that looking forward in terms of scenarios for geopolitical risks or energy risks or climate change risks, that's super, super important. And you can do this in a kind of a short, a medium, and a long term. And what I see organizations doing is aligning it to their kind of strategic horizons and longer in order to get that balance.
What is actually going on the ground? I mean, these are a lot of very high-tone concepts, but I wonder, Heather, if you could share with us some of the good or best practices of companies that are doing this well.
Yeah, so it's fair to say we're working with clients that are just starting out on their journey and some that are much further down the road. As I said, so those clients that are doing this well are bringing this together in an end-to-end view. What they're also doing, though, is they are using metrics like time to survive and time to recover and value at risk to be able to put that dollar value on risk. So we've gone from scoring risks on a kind of a 1 to 5 to saying, actually, if this materializes, it's going to cost us $50 million. What this does is it speaks to people, and I say this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it speaks to the finance folks within our organizations. And that way we can have great discussions on both proactive and reactive mitigations. Other organizations, what they're doing is super interesting. They're looking externally and they're seeing how they are positioned to deal with trends, and what the competitive landscape is looking like and how well positioned they would be if these trends were to materialize. So what would happen if the geopolitical situation in various areas of the world reduces or gets worse? How well would we respond, and how well do we think our competitors might respond? There's also a big push on this risk appetite piece. So thinking about on a supplier level, for example, what is absolutely non-negotiable, what risks are negotiable, and then what appetite we want to take for that building resilience. And just on that kind of appetite for resilience, one organization, for example, that we work with thinks about this in a very 20-80 Pareto principle approach. So they will protect the supply chain that drives the most amount of profit. So that 20% of the supply chain that drives the 80% of the revenue, they will put their mitigations there. If you ask me to qualify a second source for a product that doesn't drive that product, the answer is no. So lots of different approaches, but the key one here is, I think, that time to recover, value at risk, time to survive, that equation then helps you have that great risk discussion.
Joanne, a lot of dazzling technologies out there that promise to aid in risk management. Of course, the promise of artificial intelligence and all kinds of tools going down the line. But I'm wondering if there's a way in which companies can leverage their current technologies to better enable risk management. What do you think? What can they draw on?
Yeah, absolutely. Every client I'm speaking with is in some phase of digital transformation, and that will continue, right? And so looking at how you're advancing your supply chain maturity, creating connectivity, both not just within your own enterprise, but within your partners' enterprises, and really creating that ecosystem so that through those technologies, you can sense the risk. You can sense the disruption when they are still small vibrations and before they become seismic. And so looking at how you're leveraging the technologies and those data signals from those technologies that are not only allowing you to operate more efficiently and effectively and collaboratively, but how you are using those same data signals to find patterns and manage that risk and divert that if possible. We have lots of use cases where we're seeing that happen. Raw material component shortages, we're seeing that at supplier levels, and therefore orders are being transferred to different parts that can meet those needs, and thus mitigating that risk from even materializing. So again, looking at your technology and saying, what is it doing for me today, and how can it help me manage my risk more effectively?
We could be misguided by thinking too much about risk management as an internal process. You get all your people together in your organization, but after all, this is a supply chain with a lot of partners and a lot of need for collaboration. What types of risks actually do require collaboration? And for that matter, even among competitors? Heather, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so what I would say is that many of the challenges and the risks that we're facing will absolutely require that collaboration throughout our ecosystem partners. And kind of one area that comes to mind is in that ESG space. Lots of organizations have set very ambitious goals and targets, and there is a massive risk that we will not meet these. We will need our suppliers, for example, to reduce their emissions to help us meet our emission goals and vice versa. And in the ESG space, additionally, things like the circular economy. So raw materials will become increasingly sparse. The circular economy with suppliers, with customers, can help us to mitigate those risks. We all need kind of those ecosystem partners to mitigate, particularly those ESG risk space, and this will help us to meet both our goals and our ecosystem partners.
Joanne, what do you think about the issue of collaboration?
I think it's imperative, and it's going to occur at every risk opportunity. And so, for example, you look at something like cybersecurity and some of the numbers I reported on the increase of that risk. Even far before this moment, when I was working within industry, we were collaborating with our competitors to look at the cyber attack activity across our various enterprises and sharing that so that we could see a greater visibility of patterns. So that's just one example. Certainly during the pandemic, as stores shuttered, we saw competitors come together here in the US through NRF to lobby our politicians to reopen stores and reopen the economy. And so those are, just a couple examples of where the creativity and collaboration gets very interesting and approaches new ways in order to achieve a shared goal. I think, as we continue to see a talent crunch, we'll see greater collaboration there, even with competitors. Our colleague Tom Enright published this statistic that half of the or most of the trucks in the US are more full of air than they are actually our product. And when you think about the number of truck drivers we have and the shortage there's no reason, again, with ESG goals, there's no reason why those trucks can't be combined since they're going relatively to the same areas. So lots of opportunity for collaboration with our competitors in order to achieve our shared goals.
Great. Thanks very much. And thank you both, Heather and Joanne, for that excellent presentation and for your answers to my questions here. I think it's time let's move into the audience question and answer portion of our presentation here. And audience, we do have questions already submitted, but please feel free to continue to submit your questions while we're answering these by clicking on that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many of your questions as we possibly can, time permitting. This question is more of a geographic question as to where is risk management and smart manufacturing happening most. This questioner is citing a recent report about the state of smart manufacturing, that APAC, or Asia Pacific, is leading the change in terms of adoption of smart manufacturing initiatives. 48% of respondents said they're considering it, while EMEA, that is Europe, Middle East, Africa, follows with 33%, and then North America dragging along with 20%. What does your data show? Same scenario, and why is it like that? Who wants to take that one?
I'll take a stab at it. Sorry, I saw a note in there that somebody else might want to answer the question. I think at this point, all aspects are on the table, and I don't, from my perspective, in a strategic perspective, yes, there's greater adoption in some areas than the others, but for me, it's more about diversification of your network. Ensuring you have the right redundancies in place to manage that risk and instilling that across your practice. So for me, certainly there might be greater adoption in Asia Pac versus Europe or the Americas, but I'd be looking at it more about redundancy and resiliency than actual adoption.
This questioner is saying, what does it look like when a company tests its risk mitigation strategies? It's an interesting question. I mean, we talk about playbooks. Do you engage in simulations, virtual actual exercises? How do you actually test out your strategies, and how do you know they're successful?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a really great question, and I'm super, super pleased that somebody's asked it, actually, because I talk a lot on business continuity, and oftentimes the business continuity plan is what I would call the little book of hope, something that was written probably in 1975 and has never been looked at since. What organizations tend to do is take a variety of approaches for this. So use your assurance functions within your organizations to think about, okay, if we've set these mitigations in place to provide an external but internal view of how they think your mitigations are going. But indeed, yes, simulations, everything from a desktop walkthrough right the way through to switching off your technology, turning out the lights and saying, right, what would we do? Now, why I bring out the technology point is here that when we see organizations, we talk to lots of organizations on business continuity, things like we can't work without our warehouse management system or our ERP system. And what comes out of these tests is invariably that they don't work as we thought they might do. And that's fine, right? But what it does show that we need to invest in things like downtime procedures for when our technology is not working, but do those tests in effect externally using our assurance partners, and then through walkthroughs right the way through to a switch off everything and go. And that will be the best way of testing that your mitigations actually work.
Great, thank you. This is a question I think you might have talked about a little bit in terms of the notion of resilience equaling agility, but this question is saying, how do you assess or analyze completely unpredictable events? And they cite the example of natural disasters, but any number of other things could possibly be in that area. And we, of course, have heard a lot about the so-called black swan events, which fall into that category. What do you think? I mean, how do you deal with a completely uncertain future such as that?
Well, I would say that even natural disasters are statistically predictable. But yes, they are surprising and usually catch us off guard. Technically, a global pandemic we were overdue for. But rather than worry about the specific risk, whether it's an earthquake or another health crisis or geopolitical conflict, it is about ensuring that you are ready and resilient for that, regardless of what that risk is. And going back to the poly crisis comment, many of those risks are compounded and again, creating a very complex situation. So it essentially almost doesn't matter what that risk is. It matters more on how you're able to respond and recover from that. And so I'd be looking at that more so than trying to determine whether earthquake is going to level a factory, God forbid, or a labor strike will eliminate my talent workforce and figure out where my options are for redundancy.
Okay, thanks.
I just on that
yes,
question, what I would say is that organizations are viewing it in terms of how well would we be prepared to respond. So it doesn't matter if we lose our manufacturing site from a flood, a fire, a pandemic. What would we do if it disappeared tomorrow? So what they're doing is looking at key failure nodes throughout the supply chain, assuming it's out of action for whatever reason, and then putting in place their mitigations from that side of it. So not it's a 1 in 100 years or a 1 in 10 years, forgetting about the likelihood, just thinking about and forgetting about the event, but just thinking about what would we do if we lost this facility or this node.
Okay, cool. I'm sorry to say, unfortunately, we are just about out of time. It's just time for one final question, and I'm going to pose it first to Heather, and it is this: what is the secret to supply chain risk management?
Oh, wow, what a question. So I think that we have got to stop thinking about risk in the negative. And I know we talked about being depressed earlier, but we have to stop thinking about it in the negative, or even a compliance-based reporting tick box exercise. Doing risk management well means that we can anticipate risks. We've got well thought out tested responses, and we know they will work, and we can deliver on time and in full and still make a profit. So what we need to think about is not risk and negative, but risk and advantage for us, and how we can use that to drive advantage going forward.
Joanne, share with us your secret sauce for this, please.
Yeah, I think the secret is there is no secret. You have to do the work, and you can't limit it to just the horizon scanning, as I mentioned in my last slide. When you look at the risk, and to Heather's point, identifying the opportunity in the chaos is really what's going to separate those who lead versus those who really struggle with it. And we've seen amazing improvements in supply chain because of risk that has materialized. We've seen new business models and new partnerships, and again, creative collaboration, whether that's across all industries over the past 3 years. So I think the secret, if there really is one, is looking for the opportunity and capitalizing on the chaos versus becoming impaired from it.
Somehow I'm not depressed anymore because you ended on a positive note. Thank you so much to both of you for that. I really appreciate it. Great insights from both of you, Joanne, Joliet, and Heather Wheatley. Thank you so much for that great presentation. I do want to remind our audience, do not miss the Gartner Supply Chain Symposium and Expo, the world's most important gathering of chief supply chain officers and executives. Join us from May 8th through 10th in Orlando, Florida, and from June 5th through 7th in Barcelona, Spain. Learn more at gartner.com/conf/SC and register with the code GARTSCB, that's GARTSCB, for an exclusive discount. Finally, be on the lookout for episode 2 in our 3-part series on the dawn of the new supply chain, presented by Gartner. The topic next time will be supply chain visibility and data management. They take place in April of 2023. Stay tuned for more details. The registration form will be included in the email that will be sent to all of you tomorrow. Don't miss it. Again, Heather, Joanne, thank you so much for this great presentation. Audience, thank you for your participation and your fantastic questions. Everybody, have a great day.
Thanks, Bob.